Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to this month's webinar sponsored by NUCA National Partners. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. It will also be made available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via nuca.com. Now about your WebEx Meetings webinar screen. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read those written questions to our presenter at the conclusion of his presentation. Now let's get started. Everyone on today's webinar knows about the new $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It is a historic achievement for this nation and our industry, and the largest allocation of resources ever to our sector in this association's history. Thanks to NUCA's lobbying, the utility construction industry now has the potential to use over $200 billion out of that larger pot allocated solely for water, wastewater, highway, and broadband projects. If you build other transportation sectors, such as airport, railroad, ports, and environmental remediation, you have access to more funds through other federal programs. But in today's webinar, we're going to focus just on water and wastewater and broadband projects. Our expert presenter today is NUCA's own Zach Picanti, associated with Wyman Associates. Zach has been an invaluable part of the NUCA's government affairs team since 2019. He obtained his master's degree in public policy from my old alma mater, George Mason University, and has a degree in history from the College of William and Mary. He has an intuitive grasp on our industry's issues in Congress, enjoying a great relationship with key lawmakers such as the chairman of the T&I committee, Representative Peter DeFazio. We are very lucky to have Zach working on the NUCA team on behalf of the membership. Thanks so much for joining us today on NUCA's Webinar Wednesday. Zach, turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be talking to you all about this bill now. If you've been following NUCA communications over the last year, going all the way back to convention, we've been talking about the infrastructure bill in its various forms that it's taken, from the very nebulous discussion drafts that we received all the way back at convention, to the many revisions that this bill went through over the summer, to the very hypothetical programs that we saw may or may not make it into the bill over the last couple months, and then to the very frustrating month and a half or so delay between its Senate's passage and its final House passage. So I'm very pleased now to be able to actually talk to everyone here about this bill now that it has not only been passed by both chambers in Congress, but sent to the president and officially signed into law. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, H.R. 3684, is the largest ever federal investment in key NUCA markets. This bill is about $1.2 trillion in total. And of that $1.2 trillion, $550 billion is new spending. Now, what I mean by that is this bill originally began as an attachment to the larger annual highway bill and a whole host of other federal bills that were bundled together into this package. So a little over half of the full infrastructure bill is stuff that we would see passed every year. That's your highway funding reauthorizations, reauthorization of a bunch of other federal programs. And so when you hear 1.2 trillion for the total size of the package, that is a little misleading. A lot of that is money that we're already used to seeing. The good news is the $550 billion of new total spending, a whole lot of that is being directed towards our markets. We're seeing over $200 billion in potential utility-related work that's going to come to us over the next 5 years. And of course, the market that we're probably the most interested in and the most excited for is going to be water infrastructure. IIJA contains $55 billion in funding for water utility infrastructure construction. Of that, we're seeing $23 billion that's split between the clean water and drinking water SRFs. Specifically to call out there, that is over 3 times what we receive right now for the drinking water SRF funding. There's also $15 billion earmarked additionally, for the drinking water SRF, specifically for the purposes of removal and replacement of lead drinking water pipes. And on top of that, there's also an additional $10 billion in grants to address PFAS contamination and other so-called forever chemicals in the water supply. But water infrastructure is far from the only thing that received significant investment in the infrastructure bill. We're going to see over $40 billion allocated for broadband construction nationwide. And I'll get into that a little more later on, but there are some reasons for us to be very optimistic that a lot of that work is going to be underground broadband fiber installation. On top of that, we're going to see $110 billion for surface transportation work nationwide, funding for highways, roads, bridges. We're also looking at $73 billion for the modernization of the electric grid. There's $7 billion for the nationwide EV charging station network. There's $66 billion for passenger and freight rail, $42 billion for airports, ports, and waterways, $1 billion for municipal gas distribution replacement, which is typically not something that sees any federal investment, and a whole lot more. I could, if I had more time, spend probably close to 2 hours or more just going through all of the different federal investment programs that would touch NUCA markets. This bill is noteworthy while it does create a lot of funding channeled into existing programs, it also creates a whole host of new, smaller, targeted programs that the federal government can dole out for more small-scale infrastructure investment, research and development, and other things that are more forward-looking for the future of our industry. So there is a lot to be excited about. We're talking about very large funds of money. But before I go too far into detail, I just want to address the budget reconciliation process real quick. One of the greater frustrations for us here in Washington, and a lot of folks on the Hill, frankly, has been the tendency to conflate these two pieces of legislation. So you've heard a lot in the news about the social infrastructure package, or the Build Back Better Act. It has a lot of different names. That is a different thing from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, the BIF, which is also known today now officially as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Part of the confusion there comes from what happened over the negotiations process. For a time, these two pieces of legislation were explicitly joined by the White House and congressional Democrats. When NUCA came into town for Washington Summit, one of our goals was to help disentangle these two pieces of legislation. The Build Back Better Act is a partisan piece of legislation, unlike the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation. And the Build Back Better Act is still being negotiated in the Senate. Part of the reason that we were so frustrated with these two bills being tied together was that the infrastructure bill had already been written and was just waiting on a final vote in the House. The reconciliation bill is still actively being negotiated even today. While it has passed the House nearly along party lines, with one Democrat voting against, there are significant changes that this legislation is going to see in the Senate. It's possible they may not even finish negotiating it this year. And we were very frustrated to see what we viewed as a unambiguously positive piece of legislation, the infrastructure bill, being held up for this much more partisan and controversial piece of legislation. So we considered that a major win at Summit, that we were able to get these two bills delinked. While we're discussing it, there's quite a few things that, if you're concerned that they might be in the infrastructure bill, they're probably not. They're probably in this. So what's in this reconciliation bill? The one thing in it that I do have to mention briefly is there is additional funding in there for lead pipe removal and replacement. But there are a whole lot of things in this current draft that NUCA is very concerned about, that we're making our opposition known up on Capitol Hill about, and that we're hopeful to see get stripped out of this thing as it continues to move forward, if it even does continue to move forward, because there is some question as to whether or not Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Senator Kirsten Sinema from Arizona are even going to back the final package. So the things that we are concerned about, There are some tax provisions in there that are still included that would raise taxes on our industry. There are also a number of provisions of the PRO Act in there. Specifically, there are higher penalties in both the form of OSHA fines as well as giving the National Labor Relations Board the ability to impose direct penalties, not only on employers, but also personal liability for corporate officers who are found to have, in the eyes of the board, knowingly implemented these violations or even failed to stop them from going into effect. And then there was one thing in there that was in HR2 last year that we did support, namely private activity bonds. Those have all been removed from the legislation, which gives us all the more reason to come out in opposition to it. So NUCA is continuing to stay on top of this. If there are things that you are concerned about that are in this bill, we encourage you to reach out to us here in Washington. But I just want to note, you've probably heard, some of you, that these are the infrastructure bill that would, provide funding to social programs or aren't really funding for infrastructure. The odds are that there's just been wires crossed somewhere in the presentation, and that all of those things are really in this reconciliation bill. So again, before I go into more detail, this is not what this webinar is about, but I just want to stress these are separate pieces of legislation. And if you have any questions or concerns about it, please reach out to us. But there are no reasons to be anything less than completely excited about IIJA. And we're looking forward to continuing to celebrate its passage next year as we start to get this thing implemented. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure bill, the core infrastructure bill. This bill covers the next 5 fiscal years. So you'll start seeing funding hitting the market next year in 2022. Now, I want to stress as we go through this, a lot of us remember how the last big infrastructure investment package, the ARP back in 2009, was a shovel-ready, quick stimulus project. This is not what this is. This bill was crafted in mind as a generational investment. This funding is being planned to go out in such a way that these projects can be considered appropriately, that they'll last longer, and that they'll be spent in a wiser way to get the maximum value of this investment going forward. So that means that we're not necessarily going to see a lot of this funding come to market right away, but because it is appropriated beginning next year, we will start to see the effects going into the next calendar year. Now, most of the funding given to states is going to be distributed through existing formulas, and that is largely good news when our industry looks how to navigate these programs, because much of the funding is coming through channels we already understand. Specifically, a lot of this money is going to be going through either DOT grant programs or 2 state departments of transportation to use as they see fit, according to certain stipulations laid out in the bill. When it comes to water infrastructure, virtually all of the funding is going through the EPA by way of the state revolving fund programs. There are also competitive grants that the EPA will be administering. And then the broadband funding is going to be administered largely through existing FCC and NTIA formulas based on data that will be released next year. That is the bulk of the funding that we'll be dealing with. But there is about $76.5 billion of additional competitive grant programs that will be administered through this bill as well. Those programs touch a very wide range of programs. A lot of those programs do involve significant excavation work. Those include, but are not limited to, flood mitigation projects, waterways, coastal infrastructure projects, environmental remediation projects and brownfields, infrastructure resiliency projects, as well as a whole host of Western water infrastructure projects for those of us that are out, especially in the Southwest. To access that non-guaranteed funding, state and local governments will have to submit competitive grant applications to the federal agencies administering each program. So it will take some time before we have a sense of just how much of that money is going to flow into what markets. But agencies have already begun to start putting together their guidelines. The infrastructure bill set out timeframes that from passage Most of them, and it does vary from agency to agency, had anywhere from 60 to 90 to 180 days to start putting into place the procedures to dole this money out. Now, because this bill has been crafted as a generational investment, largely aimed, frankly, at restoring a lot of our infrastructure, not necessarily constructing new infrastructure, but fixing what we already have in many cases, agencies and states have been given significant flexibility in dispensing funds. Some funding, particularly for what I just mentioned, will come directly from federal grants to specific projects, but most of this is going to flow through the states first. Now, that flexibility kind of comes with a caveat that we all need to understand when we're crafting our strategies over the next year. Federal agencies are going to likely prioritize administration goals in deciding which projects to issue these grants to. This is where politics does come into play a little bit. And so they're going to be looking up to the White House and to their cabinet leadership as to what to weight higher when they're issuing these grants. Now, these means that projects to address things like climate change or to promote equity are largely going to be considered slightly stronger than projects that don't necessarily address those needs. So just do keep in mind, we will need to pay attention to what the administration is saying. Politics does come into play here, and those projects may just get more attention than others that don't necessarily have that angle to them. When it does come to the projects that will be administered by the states, a lot of these spending decisions are going to have to be approved by state lawmakers, and so we'll get a lot more clarity as to what each individual state is going to use with their funding in the next upcoming legislative sessions. For a lot of states, that's going to begin in January. It does vary. I can't go through every single state and territorial legislator timetable right now. We just don't have enough time in this webinar for me to break it out state by state. But at the conclusion of the webinar, I will point you to some resources so you can learn a little more about what's going on in your area. And of course, if you do have any specific questions, you're always free to reach out to me and I'll do what I can to help you from Washington. So as I said this already, federal agencies have already began to draw up, or even in some cases publish, their preliminary guidance for funding and program implementation. That's what's happening at the federal level. I know that state officials have already also begun to talk about what they're intending on doing with their money. This is where having a relationship with your state and local officials and administrators is very important. I encourage you, if you don't do so already, to talk to folks in your state government, talk to folks in your state DOTs, your regional EPA offices, ask them what their timeframes are looking like, what projects they want to prioritize. It truly does vary depending on where you are. I'll give one example that I looked into a little while ago. The Hawaii State Department of Transportation has already made it clear that a lot of their highway funding is going to be used to relocate roads and utilities in areas that are vulnerable to coastal erosion. That is largely one of the things they're choosing to prioritize with their funding. It's going to probably be different wherever you are, but the best way to find out about that is to simply reach out to your local officials and ask them what sorts of projects they're considering when it comes to looking at how their minimum funding is going to be used. So with that in mind, let's talk into the thing that is probably the most reliable, that we have the most clarity about already, and that's water infrastructure. Because this funding is largely going to be distributed through the EPA SRF programs, we kind of have a better sense at how it's going to be doled out. So the good news is, for those of us that are working primarily in the water space, you don't really have to learn how to do anything differently than you're already doing. This funding is going to continue to come through the same channels that SRF funding has been coming through for years. There's just going to be a whole lot more of it. I think that the EPA administrator did kind of put it best. This bill represents the single largest investment in water infrastructure in the history of the federal government. Certainly, at a minimum, it is the highest level of federal investment in water infrastructure since the SRF programs were created. So this is a seismic shift in many ways in what traditionally has been a very starving market towards finally having more of the resources to carry out these projects. Now, I do also want to mention this because it is a little different. But there is going to be additional funding that's going to come in the form of competitive grants for small and disadvantaged communities. It's not a whole lot of money. It's only about $50 million every year from fiscal 22 to 26. States will have to apply for that directly through the EPA, but those of you who do work in those communities, just be aware that there will be additional funding earmarked specifically for those programs. And that is coming in the form of direct grants. It's not a loan. So hopefully more of those communities will be able to move forward on projects that have been underfunded or they've not had the funded for in recent years. Now let's talk timeline a little bit here. I know that's what a lot of folks want to hear about the most. The good news is, of all of the markets we're talking about today, water is probably the one that's going to see the impact the quickest. $7.5 billion roughly is going to be distributed by the EPA for these projects for the next fiscal year. So a pretty significant chunk of money. It is well more than what we're used to seeing. It is close to 3 times what the annual appropriations are right now, so a big jump. It includes almost $3 billion earmarked specifically for lead pipe replacement projects. So I want to highlight that. That is a big opportunity for those of you who are already working on those projects. There's going to be a whole lot more of that work available. There's also close to $1 billion available for projects that work on PFAS and other contaminant addressing. That is going to be something that the federal government is going to look at more in additional legislation potentially moving forward. But this bill contains $10 billion for that, and it's going to ramp up pretty substantially in the coming years. All of these numbers that I give out, the funding that we see reach the market next year is going to be the smallest of these next 5 years. Some of the numbers in particular, like I said, for the PFAS, but for even these SRFs, are going to jump quite significantly from 22 to 23 to 24. And then in 25 and 26, they should reach the highest level of appropriations there. So keep an eye out for that. This is going to probably be the first effect of this bill that we feel. But next year is just going to be huge for water infrastructure projects. And we'll have a lot more to say about this as this funding begins to move through the process and we gain a little more clarity from the states as to how they intend to use these projects beyond project priority lists that they may have already put out. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about broadband here because broadband is pretty significantly different from water in terms of how this funding is going to be administered. The first wrinkle is that there is a minimum allocation for every state of $100 million. That is the same in every state. So California is going to get $100 million to work with here, and Wyoming is also only going to get $100 million to work with here. Rhode Island's going to get $100 million, and so will Alaska. I mean, it doesn't matter the size of the population of the state. The minimum guaranteed funding to every state is exactly the same. Now, that second bullet there is Hawaii specific. I pulled that out to show an example of how that doesn't really play into this calculation at all. So in Hawaii, 33,000 residents currently lack broadband internet. That does not affect the minimum $100 million that the state is receiving. That is truly independent of any and all formulas that this funding is going to be doled out to. Now, this funding is going to come from the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration by way of direct grants to states, and that's being broken up into a few different programs. But the one that is really going to be the lion's share of it is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program, which is going to receive $42 and about $500 million for direct grants to states, territories, DC, and Puerto Rico. That funding is going to be determined by FCC broadband mapping data. So that figure I gave for Hawaii, that is where that 33,000 comes into play. They're going to look at areas they deem are underserved and unserved rather, which they're defining as 25-3, to determine how much each state is going to receive. Now, this is one of those areas in the bill that we were a little less than satisfied with. When we were negotiating, we wanted Congress to prioritize a higher speed standard than 25 down, 3 up. Frankly, that is obsolete already. We all know that that's obsolete already. There's a great deal of frustration, I know, among many of us that are doing that work because in many instances, companies just want to achieve those speeds by patching over stuff that's already in the ground. They don't necessarily want to use that to install new fiber conduit. And for lack of a better word, a lot of that money does not go as far as it really should. That is unfortunately something we were not able to gain a complete victory on. And I'll talk a little more about why there is some room for optimism on the next slide. But that is how they're going to be determining the data. Now, those FCC maps will not be released until next year. And so, unfortunately, I can't give more clarity on how much funding states will be receiving until we have that information available. When we do have that information available, that is something that we will, of course, update everyone on. But we're not going to know about that for at least a few more months. There are a couple of other programs that are worth just mentioning real quick. There is $1 billion appropriated to enabling middle mile broadband build out. There's also $2 billion being made available for the RUS Reconnect program and an additional $2 billion that are being appropriated to the existing tribal broadband connectivity program. I'm not going to talk everyone's ears off about the million different programs that are getting significant funding. In some cases, it is $1 billion or more. But it's just worth mentioning those to show you how much funding this bill is really injecting into all aspects of the work that we do and into all sorts of different federal programs all across the country. There is significant opportunity here for us to really pick up the pace of broadband build out in a lot of communities. And this is what I was talking about when it comes to reasons for optimism. So, like I said, unfortunately, we weren't able to change the definition of unserved. That remains 25 down, 3 up. However, we were able to get the federal government for one of the first times to acknowledge the need to address underserved areas, which they defined as 100 down, 20 up. So not the 100-100 that NUCA has talked about in the past, but it is still a significant step forward. When they are prioritizing these areas, states must prioritize funding the unserved areas first, and then they can move on to areas that are defined as underserved. If both of those areas have been addressed, they can spend additional funding on improving connection to so-called community anchor institutions, and those are schools, hospitals, public safety entities, things like that. Now, states may prioritize high poverty areas and projects that provide higher speed broadband services. So that means fiber, generally speaking. And that is good news for us. That does mean that some of our arguments about the importance of future-proofing a lot of this work and installing fiber conduit, they have not fallen on deaf ears. We are making significant progress in this area. And it is worth noting that broadband service of at least 100 down, 20 up is generally required of most of these projects receiving grants. Now, funding can be used for a few other things as well as direct construction. They can use it for data collection, mapping, and planning. But generally, that funding is reserved for either direct broadband construction or projects that improve the ability to construct these broadband networks. So there is a tremendous amount of opportunity in this space that's going to be coming in the next few years. Frankly, it is a big win for the industry, getting what we've managed to get included in the broadband space over the finish line here. Now, when you look at the figures for total broadband spending in the bill, it is a little higher. It's $65 billion. There is significant assistance in the broadband space, as well as in some of the other utility spaces included in this bill, for programs that would assist ratepayers, particularly in low-income areas. And so I'm not really mentioning that because it's not direct construction funding. But again, I keep coming back to it. This bill contains a tremendous number of programs that we have a lot of reasons to feel very good about. And it's just, frankly, a huge win for the industry and quite possibly the biggest win of a bill that NUCA has really ever had since this organization was founded. When you talk to me more over the course of just email or phone calls, or if you come to convention in March and talk to me there, I'm happy to go into more detail about any of these areas, especially some of the things I'm not really talking about today, things in the energy space, electricity, infrastructure resiliency, grid modernization, charging stations, carbon capture, hydrogen. There are lots of programs in this bill that help us reach that $550 billion and $1.2 trillion overall figure. But when we look at these smaller areas that NUCA is interested in more directly, water infrastructure, broadband, we just really, frankly, I find it almost stunning just how much in the way of resources we're going to have coming our way in the next few years. And how many NUCA priorities of things like these higher speed standards we were able to get included in the final legislation. So with that little diversion in mind, coming back to the timeline issue, the NTIA has 180 days to establish rules and timeframes for the state broadband grant deployment programs. Once the FCC issues its broadband deployment maps next year, the NTIA is going to announce how much funding is available for each state and will allow states to apply for funding across several rounds. That's going to be much in the same way that the water funding that I mentioned earlier is going to be addressed. That funding will gradually step up and increase over the next few years. So while we may not necessarily feel the immediate impact of this legislation in all markets next year, certainly as we move into fiscal 23 and fiscal 24, we will see a lot of these projects start reaching contractors and work beginning on a lot of these projects in spaces that maybe aren't necessarily directly involved in the SRF programs or some of the other direct federal funding channels that we're used to working with. So I have thrown a lot of information at you. The good news is there will be a lot more information coming in the next few months. If you're interested in learning more about this legislation now, we have some resources that are already available online. There are 3 different ones that I specifically want to spotlight. The first one, and if you only go to one of these, this is the one you really should go to right away, nuca.com/fixwater. That has been one of our go-to advocacy pages over the course of the bill negotiations, Washington Summit, and then now that the bill is passed, we're continuing to update that page. It is primarily water focused. There are 3 things on there that I want to draw your attention to. The first, I've just snipped out and put on the right on the screen, is our minimum state-by-state funding guide. Now that is truly minimum funding. So when you look and you see that California is set to receive $3.5 billion in water funding, that is the lowest amount of money they are guaranteed to receive. An even better example, frankly, is the highway funding. You look at Pennsylvania, you see $11.3 billion. Pennsylvania is guaranteed to receive $11.3 billion in highway funding. And then, of course, for all of them, you see $100 million for broadband. Your state is virtually guaranteed to receive more money in all of those categories than what I've listed here. The reason that those numbers are listed there is because that is truly the least amount of money your state will receive. That does not get into the competitive grant programs. Obviously, that only covers 4 categories. There is guaranteed funding available in a lot of other categories as well, things like public transit funding, electric vehicle funding. There are significant utility-related projects that come out of a lot of those other categories, but I just can't state with guaranteed certainty, 1, how much of that funding is going to go to utility-related projects, and 2, frankly, there are just too many of those programs to list on a little snapshot sheet. So we just picked 3 here, plus, again, $100 million guaranteed down the line for broadband. If you want to learn a little more, though, about some of our other areas, we also included links to the Department of Transportation and the White House state fact sheets. Now, the White House ones and the Department of Transportation fact sheets, those are political documents, so they're going to be putting their spin on it. But there is good information included there in a little more detail about how much funding your states are set to receive, and some particular highlights about needs and projects of importance that the White House wants to prioritize and that the state DOTs are looking to specifically provide funding to. One other document on there that I do want to mention, if you haven't seen it already, this bill is a huge step in the right direction. Advocacy is frankly going to be, I think, more important than ever going into the next year, because with the way that Washington works, a lot of folks are just going to want to say, well, we've done infrastructure. We don't really need to keep doing infrastructure. Nothing refutes that point, in my opinion, more effectively than the state water needs assessments documents. That is a state by state list of just how much water funding is needed to fix the chronic issues available in every state, frankly, as well as a comparison of what the SRF funding looked like before the infrastructure bill passed. And if you go to one of those and look, you'll see in almost every instance, federal funding right now compared to the need is truly a drop in the bucket. Even with this bill being passed, there is a lot more room to improve. And I just keep picking on lead pipes because, frankly, the administration is making themselves an easy target here. The Biden administration has claimed on numerous occasions that the infrastructure bill combined with the reconciliation bill will provide enough funding to remove and replace every lead pipe in America. And that is simply not true. Between both of those bills right now, we don't get anywhere near the overall number. Our estimate for that is $45 billion for lead pipe removal and replacement alone. So there is significant additional advocacy work that we'll be doing in the coming years. And that state water needs assessments page, when you're talking with your state officials or your representatives here in Washington, just point them to that and let them know that while we're really grateful that this bill passed and it is truly a transformative bill in many aspects, our work is not done here. So with that in mind, I encourage you to keep one eye on NUCA.com's advocacy page, where we post updated fact sheets and additional information, press releases, position papers and statements that we've worked on here in Washington. And as always, if you want the latest on what's going on here, a great resource, if you're on Twitter, follow NUCA National. We make sure to put a lot of resources out there, news articles, and just try to keep folks as best informed as to not only what's going on here in Washington, but the progress on getting this infrastructure bill actually implemented. So I've talked to folks for a lot. We've got some time for questions now, but I just want to stress there is a lot more information that's going to come from us in the next coming months. So just keep one eye on us. And of course, if you have any questions about how things are going in the coming months, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be available on the last slide. And we'll also be distributing these slides to participants after the presentation is over. So with that, questions?
Thank you, Zach, for that very, very informative presentation. Let's open to questions. As Zach said, you can do it in two ways. You can use the chat feature to submit a question, and I'll read the question to the presenter, or if you prefer, just unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. We have one in the chat feature, and it is $66 billion for passenger and freight rail. Does that include light rail?
That is an excellent question. So when it comes to what that funding includes, I am lumping in both freight rail and passenger rail. Much of that passenger rail funding is dedicated to Amtrak. A lot of it, frankly, most of it is dedicated to Amtrak, so not especially light rail. However, there is significant public transit funding in this bill. Agencies are given a pretty wide degree of flexibility when it comes to where that funding is able to go. So that is really, I think, where the opportunity for light rail work is. Frankly, the bulk of that funding, when we talk about passenger rail, if anybody works on any of the Amtrak rail corridor in the Northeast, that is kind of what they've really tried to laser focus a lot of that funding on. Of course, that is really Amtrak's one profitable route, and it needs a significant amount of work. Light rail and even additional public transit funding is one of those areas in this bill that folks were a little disappointed how it ended up in the final package. It was originally significantly more than it ended up being. A lot of that was stripped out. And so, frankly, the best opportunity for light rail funding is largely going to be in that public transit allocation. And I have that number, so I'll circle back to that in a moment. I've just got to find where I wrote that down as well.
Are there any other questions? Oh, my wish is fulfilled. I have another one, Zach. Any guidance or recommendations you can provide that might help highlight local needs to officials, such as site visits? Anything on that in terms of publicity, reaching out, contacting offices, not just federal, but also state?
Yes, and that is an excellent question. So first, before I address that, it's $39 billion for public transit, which is a pretty positive number. Originally speaking, $39 billion. And then that was largely preserved in the House package. So not quite as big a cut as we feared at one point, but of course the original House bill before it was amended by the Senate did have more that would go to that. Some of that $39 billion is also going to things though like zero emission buses and a few other modernization things that aren't necessarily construction work. And so that's kind of why I hesitate to include that in my broader breakdown of how much money is going towards our industry. Now, to answer the new question, yes, guidance and recommendations that I can provide to highlight local needs. Number one, if you have a project that you know about already on the top of your head that desperately needs to be done, just spotlight that. You all are experts in your community's needs, more so than, frankly, even a lot of state and local officials, because you're the ones that actually do the work. So if there's something you know has been trying and failing to get off the ground for years, mention that right away as, hey, this project has been talked about for decades and it has never been done. Is there funding available for this? Can we get this bridge fixed? Can we, finally fix our town's leaky water mains on Main Street? Those sorts of issues that are, strongly locally relevant are always a great angle. Now, job site visits are probably the single best thing you can do for this. And here's why. Next year is an election year. Regardless of whether or not your representative voted for this bill or did not vote for this bill. And unfortunately, it was still somewhat of a political vote. So we're kind of looking the other way on a lot of folks that voted against it because we understand why they had to. Whether they voted for it or not, they're going to want to help tout the benefits that their communities are seeing. The fact that people are being, going to work, new jobs are being created, things that have needed to be done for decades are finally being done. There's going to be a lot of appetite for members of Congress to get out into your districts and to show what they've done in Washington and how that is directly helping their communities. So if you have projects that are funded by EPA SRF programs, state DOT funding that is coming as a result of this infrastructure bill, anything that you can conceivably tie to this bill, and frankly, you can probably conceivably tie most of the work you're doing to this bill, whether indirectly or directly, that is a great angle to offer to your members of Congress and your senators to try to get them out to a job site. While you have them at those job sites, talk about the issues that we're going to be facing now, looking forward. When we're trying to build all of these projects that just got funded, we can't build them if we don't have the labor force. We can't build them if we're still running into supply chain issues. So those things that you're encountering that are hindering your company's ability to do business, that's a good opportunity to bring these up with the members, not only just at the job site, but mention those to your members of Congress. Say, hey, the bill passed. Can I set up a meeting so we can talk about this a little bit? Don't hesitate to reach out to them and just try to schedule a face-to-face when they're back in the districts over the holidays. Set up a Zoom call to talk to them about this more. Of course, Nuka National is always available to help provide additional resources. We have fact sheets, the state water needs assessments, all sorts of stuff that we can provide you to help you with that. The one thing I do want to say as an aside, if you happen to live in a district or have projects in a district with one of the 13 Republicans that voted in favor of the infrastructure bill in the House, please, 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 please reach out to them. Try to set up a job site visit, or even if you can't do that, just send them a note thanking them for what they've done to help the industry. These folks took a very politically risky vote. Some of them are facing primary challenges as a result of it. And with the numbers in the House, the way that they fell during the vote, the infrastructure bill would not have passed if it were solely up to Democrats to get it over the finish line. Now, in the Senate, it was a truly bipartisan bill. We had almost 70 votes in the Senate for this bill, with 19 Republicans voting in favor, including a decent amount of the Republican leadership team in the Senate. In the House, we only had 13 Republicans vote for it, but we had 6 Democrats oppose it, which is more than the number of seats that the Democrats could afford to lose if they were going to pass it with only Democratic votes. So it's very important that we show to these folks that we recognize what they've done, thank them for voting in a way that helped out not only the industry, but the country as a whole, and really kind of give them the credit they deserve in helping us move this bill across the finish line. A list of who those members are has been previously put out by NUCA. I'm happy to if anybody has any questions about whether or not their member voted for the bill, you feel free to reach out to me and I can answer that for you. But just to stress that, if your member is a Republican, frankly, senator or member of the House, and they voted for this bill, just thank them for why they voted the way they did. And also, by the way, that goes the other way around. If they voted against the bill, please feel free, set up a meeting with them and make them explain themselves. We really know why they voted the way they did, and we're largely fine with it, but there's no harm in making them feel a little uncomfortable about it.
That's as well, too, since this is about publicity. Another terrific avenue to actually publicize the projects, the potential projects, is through your chapter. Reach out to your chapter executive director. 2 of our chapters, I know, NUCA of Kansas City and NUCA of Hawaii, end up holding an annual sort of a media event highlighting potential projects that are completed, bringing together local officials, elected officials as well, too, contractors, and the media. I think both of their presentations are online. I certainly work with any chapter that wants to end up highlighting it, but I think it's a terrific way of telling telling to the community, here's what's on the way, here's what we can do, and here's what we'd like to do as well, too. The local media can be an absolutely very powerful tool to sort of highlighting, here's what we want to do. Now, I've encouraged all the chapters to end up to doing something like that. It's like we've got another question. Are there provisions within the bill to reimburse utilities for relocation of existing facilities which are being driven by these federally funded projects?
That is an excellent question. Yes. A lot of the funding in this bill, especially a lot of the DOT funding, is being handled through existing channels. Whatever existing programs that you deal with every year that revolve around that exist, those are still in place for a lot of these. Now, the one wrinkle, though, and the reason I'm glad you brought this up, is there is a lot of funding in here for infrastructure resiliency. A fair amount of that is being aimed at what they're calling climate resiliency projects, especially in areas that are prone to wildfires, storms, droughts, or most notably floods. And so a lot of those projects that are going to be funded for relocation are flood-prone areas. So that is part of what is being funded by those projects is utility relocation. They're not just moving the road, they're moving everything under the road away from areas that are increasingly prone to floods or other extreme weather events that would compromise their safety or usefulness. That also applies to areas that are seeing a lot of coastal erosion. That's why I spotlighted Hawaii earlier. Their state DOT has said that those are grants that they're really going to be eyeing. They're going to try to prioritize getting a piece of those to relocate coastal roads, coastal utilities. And so those funds would be used to help reimburse and manage the movement of those projects. I can't really give a more specific answer than that. I'm happy to look into that a little more. This is one of the things about this bill. It is, close to 2,000 pages long, and so there are a lot of. I have read the whole thing. Actually, it took me a long time to get through it, but there are a lot of very small clauses and such in there that I just need to go back and revisit to determine what exactly is how exactly that might interact with other parts of the bill.
Thank you, Zach. And I know as well, too, talking to some members, the creativity that I think we can all unleash in terms of using some of these funds for projects you never thought of is sky's the limit. I remember a conversation I had with someone discussing the electric vehicle charging stations. For these stations, there's a portion of it that are going to be built underground, mostly in terms of delivery of the cable, but the other infrastructure as well, too. They hadn't realized just in terms of how much potential business they could have just by doing the underground portion of that project. So there are, just reading this, and unlike you, Zach, I was not going to read 2,000 pages. I'm glad you did. But there are so many opportunities the federal government has given this industry, to think creatively in terms of new avenues, new opportunities for business that we've just either never explored before or didn't have the chance to do it. So I invite you to end up, reaching out in terms of areas where you think your business would like to go and seeing what's available. And I think you'll be surprised. There's a lot of funds available now through this bill that can help grow your business in ways you'd never thought of before. We're up against the hour, 7 minutes into it, so this is probably a good place to stop. I don't know if anyone has any other thing to, another question to ask. If you do, of course, Zach and Evan are always available, phone or email as well, too. Thank you, Zach, for bringing that back up. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. Zach, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our guests. We would also like to thank our national partners for the continued and very kind support of NUCA and our educational webinar series. Today's webinar was recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. A recording of this webinar will also be made available on the nuca.com website and our YouTube channel over the next few days. However, it seems everybody wanted it. The PDF of Zach's presentation is now available at nuca.com/webinars. Just go to our website, click on webinars, and you'll be able to download the PDF from that. And thank you for your time today to join us for this Webinar Wednesday and for supporting NUCA. Our next Webinar Wednesday will be held on January 12th, 2022, sponsored by MemberFi and discussing NUCA's new 401k benefit for member companies. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.